Mountain Devils. Let me make myself clear. I don't want you to go to any trouble on my account. Your hospitality, which I appreciate greatly, is quite sufficient. Yes, sir, that's very considerate of you, sir, replied the priest. I'd just like to relax, that's all. By all means. Now, I hope you'll forgive my rudeness, said the samurai, stretching out casually on his side and propping his graying head on his forearm. The guest who just arrived at the Tokuganji was Nagaoka Sado, a high-ranking vassal of Lord Hosokawa Tadaoki of Buzen. He had little time for personal matters, but he invariably came on such occasions as the anniversary of his father's death, usually staying overnight, since the temple was some 20 miles from Edo. For a man of his rank, he traveled unostentatiously, accompanied this time by only 2 samurai and 1 young personal attendant. To get away from the Hosokawa establishment, even for a short time, he had to trump up an excuse. He rarely had the chance to do as he pleased, and now that he did, he was fully enjoying the local sake while listening to the croaking of frogs. Briefly, he could forget about everything, the problems of administration, and the constant need to be attuned to the nuances of daily affairs. After dinner, the priest quickly cleared the dishes and left. Sato was chatting idly with his attendants, who were seated next to the wall, only their faces showing in the light of the lamp. I could just lie here forever and enter nirvana, like the Buddha, Sato said lazily. Careful you don't catch a cold, the night air is damp. Oh, leave me alone, this body survived a few battles. It can hold its own against a sneeze or two. But just smell those ripe blossoms. Nice fragrance, isn't it? I don't smell anything. Don't you? If your sense of smell is that poor, you sure you don't have a cold yourself? They were engrossed in this kind of seemingly light banter when suddenly the frogs fell silent and a loud voice shouted, You devil, what are you doing here, staring into the guest room? Sato's bodyguards were on their feet instantly. What is it? Who's out there? As their cautious eyes scanned the garden, the clatter of small feet receded in the direction of the kitchen. A priest looked in from the veranda, bowed, and said, Sorry for the disturbance. It's only one of the local children. There's nothing to worry about. Are you sure? Yes, of course. He lives a couple miles from here. His father worked as a groom until he died recently, but his grandfather is said to have been a samurai, and every time he sees one, he stops and stares, with his finger in his mouth. Sato sat up. You mustn't be too hard on him. If he wants to be a samurai, bring him in. We'll have some sweets and talk it over. By now, Iori had reached the kitchen. Hey, Granny, he shouted, I've run out of millet. Fill this up for me, will you? The sack he thrust out to the wrinkled old woman who worked in the kitchen would have held half a bushel. She shouted right back, Watch your tongue, you beggar. You talk as if we owe you something. You've got a lot of nerve to begin with, said a priest who was washing dishes. The head priest took pity on you, so we're giving you food, but don't be so insolent. If you're asking for a favor, do it politely. I'm not begging. I gave the priest the pouch my father left me. There's money in it, plenty of money. And how much could a groom living out in the sticks leave his son? Are you going to give me the millet, yes or no? There you go again. Just look at yourself. You're crazy, taking orders from that fool Ronin. Where did he come from anyway? Who is he? Why should he be eating your food? None of your business. Digging around that barren plain where there's never going to be a field or garden or anything else. The whole village is laughing at you. Who asked your advice? Whatever's wrong with that Ronin's head must be catching. What do you expect to find up there? A pot of gold like in a fairy tale? You're not even dry behind the ears and you're already digging your own grave. Shut up and give me the millet. The millet, now! The priest was still teasing Iori a couple of minutes later when something cold and slimy hit his face. His eyes popped. Then he saw what it was, a warty toad. He screamed and lunged for Iori, but just as he collared him, another priest arrived to announce that the boy was wanted in the samurai's room. The head priest had also heard the commotion and rushed to the kitchen. Did he do something to upset our guest? He asked worriedly. No, Sato just said he'd like to talk to him. He'd like to give him some sweets, too. The head priest hurriedly took Iori by the hand and delivered him personally to Sato's room. As Iori timidly sat down beside the priest, Sato asked, How old are you? 13. And you want to become a samurai? That's right, replied Iori, nodding vigorously. Well, well. Why don't you come and live with me then? You'd have to help with the housework at the beginning, but later I'd make you one of the apprentice samurai. Iori shook his head silently. Sato, taking this for bashfulness, assured him that the offer was serious. Iori, flashing an angry look, said, I heard you wanted to give me some sweets. Where are they? Paling, the head priest slapped him on the wrist. Don't scold him, Sato said reprovingly. He liked children and tended to indulge them. He's right. A man should keep his word. Have the sweets brought in. When they arrived, Iori began stuffing them into his kimono. Sato, a little taken aback, asked, Aren't you going to eat them here? No, my teacher's waiting for me at home. Oh, you have a teacher? Without bothering to explain himself, Iori bolted from the room and disappeared through the garden. Sato thought this behavior highly amusing. Not so the head priest, who bowed to the floor 2 or 3 times before going to the kitchen in pursuit of Iori. Where is that insolent brat? He picked up a sack of millet and left. They listened for a moment, but heard only a discordant screeching. Iori had plucked a leaf from a tree and was trying to improvise a tune. None of the few songs he knew seemed to work. The groom's chanty was too slow, the Bon Festival songs too complicated. Finally, he settled on a melody resembling the sacred dance music at the local shrine. This suited him well enough, for he liked the dances, which his father had sometimes taken him to see. About halfway to Hotengahara, at a point where two streams joined to make a river, he gave a sudden start. The leaf flew from his mouth along with a spray of saliva, and he leapt into the bamboo beside the road. Standing on a crude bridge were 3 or 4 men, engaging in a furtive conversation. "It's them," Iori exclaimed softly. A remembered threat rang in his frightened ears. When mothers in this region scolded their children, they were apt to say, "If you're not good, the mountain devils will come down and get you." The last time they had actually come had been in the fall of the year before last. 20 miles or so from here, in the mountains of Hitachi, there was a shrine dedicated to a mountain deity. Centuries earlier, the people had so feared this god that the villages had taken turns making annual offerings of grain and women to him. When a community's turn came, the inhabitants had assembled their tribute and gone in a torchlight procession to the shrine. As time went on, and it became evident that the god was really only a man, they became lax in making their offerings. During the period of the civil wars, the so-called mountain god had taken to having his tribute collected by force. Every 2 or 3 years, a pack of brigands, armed with halberds, hunting spears, axes, anything to strike terror into the hearts of peaceful citizens, would descend on first one community, then the next, carrying away everything that caught their fancy, including wives and daughters. If their victims put up any resistance, the plundering was accompanied by slaughter. The last raid, still vivid in his memory, Iori cringed in the underbrush. A group of 5 shadows came running across the field to the bridge. Then, through the night mist, another small band, and still another, until the bandits numbered between 40 and 50. Iori held his breath, and stared while they debated the course of action. They soon reached a decision. Their leader issued a command and pointed toward the village. The men rushed off like a swarm of locusts. Before long, the mist was rent by a great cacophony. Birds, cattle, horses, the wailing of people young and old. Iori quickly made up his mind to get help from the samurai at the Tokuganji, but the minute he left the shelter of the bamboo, a shout came from the bridge. "Who's there?" He had not seen the 2 men left behind to stand guard. Swallowing hard, he ran for all he was worth, but his short legs were no match for those of grown men. "Where do you think you're going?" shouted the man who got a hold of him first. "Who are you?" Instead of crying like a baby, which might have thrown the men off guard, Iori scratched and fought against the brawny arms imprisoning him. "He saw all of us together. He was going to go tell someone." "Let's beat him up and dump him in a rice field. I've got a better idea." They carried Iori to the river and threw him down the bank, and jumping down after him, tied him to one of the bridge posts. "There, that takes care of him." The 2 ruffians climbed back up to their station on the bridge. The temple bell tolled in the distance. Iori watched horrified as the flames rising from the village dyed the river a bloody red. The sound of babies crying and women wailing came closer and closer. Then wheels rumbled onto the bridge. Half a dozen of the bandits were leading ox carts and horses loaded with loot. "Filthy scum!" screamed a masculine voice. "Give me back my wife!" The scuffle on the bridge was brief but fierce. Men shouted, metal clanged, a shriek went up, and a bloody corpse landed at Iori's feet. A second body splashed into the river, spraying his face with blood and water. One by one, farmers fell from the bridge, 6 of them in all. The bodies rose to the surface and floated slowly downstream, but one man, not quite dead, grasped at the reeds and clawed the earth until he had pulled himself halfway out of the water. "You!" cried Iori. "Untie this rope! I'll go for help! I'll see that you get your revenge!" Then his voice rose to a bellow. "Come on, untie me! I've got to save the village!" The man lay motionless. Straining at his bonds with all his might, Iori finally loosened them enough to squirm down and kick the man in the shoulder. The face that turned toward his was blotched with mud and gore, eyes dull and uncomprehending. The man crawled painfully closer. With his last ounce of strength, he undid the knots. As the rope fell loose, he collapsed and died. Iori looked cautiously up at the bridge and bit his lip. There were more bodies up there, but luck was with him. A cartwheel had broken through a rotten plank. The thieves hurrying to pull it out didn't notice his escape. Realizing he couldn't make it to the temple, Iori tiptoed along in the shadows until he reached a place shallow enough to cross. When he gained the other bank, he was on the edge of Hotengahara. He covered the remaining mile to the cabin as though lightning was nipping at his heels. As he neared the knoll where the cabin stood, he saw that Musashi was standing outside, looking at the sky. "Come quick!" he shouted. "What happened? We have to go to the village. Is that where the fire is? Yes, the mountain devils have come again." "Devils? Bandits?" "Yes, at least 40 of them. Please hurry, we have to rescue the villagers." Musashi ducked into the cabin and emerged with his swords. While he was tying his sandals, Iori said, "Follow me, I'll show you the way." "No, you stay here." Iori could not believe his ears. It's too dangerous. I'm not scared. You'd be in the way. You don't even know the shortest way there. The fire's all the guide I need. Just be a good boy and stay right here. Yes, sir. Yori nodded obediently, but with deep misgivings. He turned his head toward the village and watched somberly as Musashi shrieked off in the direction of the red glow. The bandits had tied their female captives, moaning and screaming, in a row and were pulling them mercilessly toward the bridge. "Stop your squawking," shouted one bandit. "You act like you don't know how to walk. Move!" And when the women held back, the ruffians lashed them with whips. One woman fell, dragging down others, seizing the rope, forcing them back on their feet. One man snarled, "Stubborn bitches, what have you got to groan about? Stay here and you work like slaves the rest of your lives, all for a bit of millet. Look at you, nothing but skin and bones. You'd be a lot better off having fun with us." Picking one of the healthier-looking animals, which were all heavily loaded with booty, they tied the rope to it and gave it a sharp slap on the rump. The slack in the rope was snapped up suddenly, and fresh shrieks rent the air as women were yanked forward again. Those who fell were dragged along, with their faces scraping the ground. "Stop!" screamed one. "My arms are coming off!" A wave of raucous laughter swept through the brigands. At that moment, horse and woman came to a dead halt. "What's going on? Somebody's up ahead!" All eyes strained to see. "Who's there?" roared one bandit. The silent shadow walking toward them carried a white blade. The bandits, trained to be sensitive to odors, instantly recognized the one they smelled now, blood dripping from the sword. As the men in front fell back clumsily, Musashi sized up the enemy force. He counted 12 men, all hard-muscled and brutish-looking. Recovering from the initial shock, they readied their weapons and took defensive stances. One ran forward with an axe. Another, carrying a hunter's spear, approached diagonally, keeping his body low and aiming at Musashi's ribs. The man with the axe was the first to go. "Ah!" Sounding as though he'd bitten his own tongue off, he weaved crazily and collapsed in a heap. "Don't you know me?" Musashi's voice rang out sharply. "I am the protector of the people, a messenger from the god who watches over this village." In the same breath, he seized the spear pointed at him, wrested it from its owner's hands, and threw it violently to the ground. Moving swiftly into the band of ruffians, he was kept busy countering thrusts from all sides, but after the first surge, made while they still fought with confidence, he had a good idea of what lay ahead. It was a matter not of numbers, but of the opposition's cohesiveness and self-control. Seeing one man after another turned into a blood-spurting missile, the bandits were soon falling back to ever greater distances, until finally they panicked and lost all semblance of organization. Musashi was learning even as he fought, acquiring experience that would lead him to specific methods to be used by a smaller force against a larger one. This was a valuable lesson, and it couldn't be learned in a fight with a single enemy. His two swords were in their scabbards. For years he practiced to master the art of seizing his opponent's weapon and turning it against him. Now he'd put study into practice, taking the sword away from the first man he encountered. His reason wasn't that his own sword, which he thought of as his soul, was too pure to be sullied by the blood of common brigands. He was being practical. Against such a motley array of weapons, a blade might get chipped or even broken. When the 5 or 6 survivors fled toward the village, Musashi took a minute or two to relax and catch his breath, fully expecting them to return with reinforcements. Then he freed the women and ordered those who could stand to take care of the others. After some words of comfort and encouragement, he told them it was up to them to save their parents and children and husbands. "You'd be miserable if you survived and they perished, wouldn't you?" he asked. There was a murmur of agreement. "You yourselves have the strength to protect yourselves and save the others, but you don't know how to use that strength. That's why you're at the mercy of outlaws. We're going to change that. I'm going to help you by showing you how to use the power you have. The first thing to do is arm yourselves." He had collected the weapons lying about and distributed one to each of the women. "Now follow me and do just as I say. You mustn't be afraid. Try to believe that the god of this district is on your side." As he led the women toward the burning village, other victims emerged from the shadows and joined them. Soon the group had grown into a small army of nearly 100 people. Women tearfully hugged loved ones. Daughters were reunited with parents, wives with husbands, mothers with children. At first, as the woman described how Musashi had dealt with the bandits, the men listened with shocked expressions on their faces, not believing that this could be the idiot Ronin from Hotengahara. When they did accept it, their gratitude was obvious, despite the barrier imposed by their dialect. Turning to the men, Musashi told them to find weapons. Anything will do, even a good heavy stick or a length of fresh bamboo. No one disobeyed or even questioned his orders. Musashi asked, "How many bandits are there in all?" "About 50. "How many houses in the village?" 70. Musashi calculated that there was probably a total of 700 or 800 people. Even allowing for old people and children, the brigands would still be outnumbered by as much as 10 to 1. He smiled grimly at the thought that these peaceful villagers had believed that they had no recourse but to throw up their hands in despair. He knew that if something was not done, the atrocity would be repeated. Tonight, he wanted to accomplish 2 things: show the villagers how to protect themselves and see that the brigands were banished forever. "Sir," cried a man who had just come from the village, "they're on their way here." Though the villagers were armed now, the news made them uneasy. They showed signs of breaking and running. To restore confidence, Musashi said loudly, "There's nothing to be alarmed about. I was expecting this. I want you to hide on both sides of the road, but first listen to my instructions." He talked rapidly but calmly, briefly repeating points for emphasis. "When they get here, I'll let them attack me, then I'll pretend to run away. They'll follow me. You, all of you, stay where you are. I won't need any help. After a time, they'll come back. When they do, attack. Make lots of noise. Take them by surprise. Strike at their sides, legs, chests, any areas that are unguarded. When you've taken care of the first bunch, hide again and wait for the next one. Keep doing this until they're all dead." He barely had time to finish and the peasants to disperse before the marauders appeared. From their dress and lack of coordination, Musashi guessed that theirs was a primitive fighting force, of a sort that might have been common long ago when men hunted and fished for sustenance. The name Tokugawa meant nothing to them, no more than did Toyotomi. The mountains were their tribal home. The villagers existed to provide them with food and supplies. "Stop!" ordered the man at the head of the pack. There were about 20 of them, some with crude swords, some with lances, one with a battle axe, another with a rusty spear. Silhouetted against the glow of the fire, their bodies looked like a demonic, jet-black shadows. "Is he the one? Yeah, that's him, all right." Some 60 feet ahead of them, Musashi stood his ground, blocking the road. Disconcerted, they began to doubt their own strength, and for a short time none of them moved, but only for a moment. Then Musashi's blazing eyes started to pull them inexorably toward them. "You, the son of a bitch, trying to get in our way?" "Right!" roared Musashi, raising his sword and tearing into them. There was a loud reverberation, followed by a whirlwind fray in which it was impossible to make out individual movements. It was like a spinning swarm of winged ants. The rice fields on one side of the road and the embankment lined with trees and bushes on the other were ideal for Musashi, since they provided a measure of cover, but after the first skirmish, he executed a strategic withdrawal. "See that? The bastard's running away! After him!" They pursued him to a far corner of the nearest field, where he turned and faced them. With nothing behind him, his position seemed worse, but he kept his opponents at bay by moving swiftly to right and left. Then the moment one of them made a false move, Musashi struck. His dark form seemed to flit from place to place, a geyser of blood rising before him each time he paused. The bandits who were not killed were soon too dazed to fight, while Musashi grew sharper with every strike. It was a different sort of battle from the one at Ichijoji. He did not have the feeling of standing on the border between life and death, but he had reached a plane of selflessness, body and sword performing without the need of conscious thought. His attackers fled in complete disarray. A whisper went along the line of villagers. "They're coming." Then a group of them jumped out of hiding and fell upon the first 2 or 3 bandits, killing them almost effortlessly. The farmers melted into darkness again, and the process was repeated until all the bandits had been ambushed and slain. Counting the corpses bolstered the villagers' confidence. "They're not so strong after all," gloated one man. "Wait, here comes another. Get him! No, don't attack, it's the Ronin." With a minimum of confusion, they lined up along the road like soldiers being reviewed by their general. All eyes were fixed on Musashi's bloody clothing and dripping sword, whose blade was chipped in a dozen places. He threw it away and picked up a lance. "Our work's not done here," he said. "Get yourselves some weapons and follow me. By combining your strength, you can drive the marauders out of the village and rescue your families." Not one man hesitated. The women and children also found weapons and followed along. The damage to the village was not as extensive as they had feared, because the dwellings were set well apart, but the terrified farm animals were raising a great ruckus, and somewhere a baby was crying its lungs out. Loud popping noises came from the roadside where the fire had spread to the grove of green bamboo. The bandits were nowhere in sight. "Where are they?" asked Musashi. "I seem to smell sake. Where would there be a lot of sake in one place?" The villagers were so absorbed in gaping at the fires that nobody had noticed the smell, but one of them said, "Must be the village headsman's house. He's got barrels of sake." "Then that's where we'll find them," said Musashi. As they advanced, more men came out of the hiding and joined their ranks. Musashi was gratified by the growing spirit of unity. "That's it, there," said one man, pointing out a large house surrounded by an earthen wall. While the peasants were getting themselves organized, Musashi scaled the wall and invaded the bandits' stronghold. The leader and his chief lieutenants were ensconced in a large, dirty-floored room, swilling sake and forcing their attention on young girls they were holding captive. "Don't get excited," the leader shouted angrily in a rough mountain dialect. "He's only one, man. I shouldn't have to do anything myself. The rest of you take care of him." He was upbraiding an underling who had rushed him with the news of the defeat outside the village. As their chief fell silent, the others became aware of the hum of angry voices beyond the wall and stirred uneasily. Dropping half-eaten chickens and the sake cups, they jumped to their feet and instinctively reached for their weapons. Then they stood there, staring at the entrance to the room. Musashi, using his lance as a pole, vaulted through a high side window, landing directly behind the chief. The man whirled around only to be impaled on the lance. Letting out a fearsome "ah!" He grabbed with both hands the lance lodged in his chest. Musashi calmly let go of the lance, and the man toppled face down into the ground, the blade and most of the shaft projecting from his back. The second man to attack Musashi was relieved of his sword. Musashi sliced him through, brought the blade down on the head of a third man, and thrust it into the chest of a fourth. The others made helter-skelter for the door. Musashi hurled a sword at them, and in a continuation of the same motion, extricated the lance from the chief's body. "Don't move!" he bellowed. He charged with the lance held horizontally, parting the bandits like water struck with a pole. This gave him enough room to make effective use of the long weapon, which he now swung with a deftness that tested the very resiliency of his black oak shaft, striking sideways, slicing downward, thrusting viciously forward. The bandits attempting to get out of the gate found their way blocked by the armed villagers. Some climbed the wall. When they hit the ground, most were slaughtered on the spot. Of the few who succeeded in escaping, nearly all received crippling wounds. For a time, the air was filled with shouts of triumph from young and old, male and female, and as the first flush of victory subsided, man and wife, parents and children hugged each other and shed tears of joy. In the midst of this ecstatic scene, someone asked, "What if they come back?" There was a moment of sudden anxious stillness. "They won't be back," Musashi said firmly. "Not to this village. But don't be overconfident. Your business is using plows, not swords. If you grow too proud of your fighting ability, the punishment heaven will mete out to you will be worse than any raid by mountain devils." "Did you find out what happened?" Nagaoka Sato asked his two samurais when they got back to the Tokuganji. In the distance, across field and swamp, he could see that the light of the fires in the village was fading. "Everything's quieted down now. Did you chase the bandits away? How much damage was done in the village?" "The villagers killed all but a few of them before we got there. The others got away." "Well, that's odd." He looked surprised, for if this was true, he had some thinking to do about the way of governing his own lord's district. On leaving the temple the following day, he directed his horse toward the village, saying, "It's out of the way, but let's have a look." A priest came along to show them the way, and while they rode, Sato observed, "Those bodies along the roadside don't look to me as though they were cut down by farmers," and asked his samurai for more details. The villagers, foregoing sleep, were hard at work, burying corpses and cleaning up debris from the conflagration. But when they saw Sato and the samurai, they ran outside their houses and hid. "Get one of the villagers to come here, and let's find out exactly what happened," he said to the priest. The man who came back with the priest gave them a fairly detailed account of the night's events. "Now it begins to make sense," Sato said, nodding. "What's this Ronin's name?" The peasant, never having heard Musashi's name, cocked his head to one side. When Sato insisted on knowing it, the priest asked about for a time and came up with the required information. "Miyamoto Musashi?" Sato said thoughtfully. "Is he the man the boy spoke of as his teacher?" "That's right. From the way he's been trying to develop a piece of wasteland on Hotengahara, the villagers thought he was a little soft in the head." "I'd like to meet him," said Sato, but then he remembered the work waiting for him in Edo. "Never mind, I'll talk to him the next time I come out here." He turned his horse around and left the peasant standing by the road. A few minutes later, he reined up in front of the village headman's gate. There, written on a shiny ink on a fresh board, hung a sign. "Reminder for the people of the village. Your plow is your sword. Your sword is your plow. Working in the fields, don't forget the invasion. Thinking of the invasion, don't forget your fields. All things must be balanced and integrated. Most important, do not oppose the way of successive generations." Who wrote this? The headman had finally come out and was now bowing to the ground before Sato. "Musashi," he answered. Turning to the priest, Sato said, "Thank you for bringing us here. It's too bad I couldn't meet this Musashi, but just now I don't have the time. I'll be back this way before long."